And as an industry as a whole, we are fighting a battle for acceptance today. People are struggling to understand the energy transition, even though it will drive down their cost, it will make the energy supply more secure, it will make it more sustainable in the long term. But still, there's an acceptance problem.
Prices came down a lot for these generators, mainly PV, and we see the same on the storage side. But storage is not only because price goes down, but because we want to move to electric mobility and electric heating, and price is only one of the components, but a major driver. And this will now accelerate.
The reliability of the electricity network is something that most of us take for granted most of the time. That's until, of course, the lights go out, as they did just in the lead up to the recording of this special podcast series on the Iberian Peninsula, leaving something like 50 to 60 million people without power, everything ground to a halt. It made the discussion of energy resilience a particularly timely one on this episode of the Powering Through podcast. And my guests were Julian Jansen from Fluence, who is the managing director of growing markets. And he was also a very early battery analyst with S&P Global. He was joined by Michael Schreiber from Octopus Energy, one of the most innovative energy retailers in Europe and expanding elsewhere as well. They really try to get flexibility into the electricity system by working with their customers to shape their electricity usage, their power consumption to times that is both friendly for the grid and good for the customer's bottom line, and also good for renewable production. And as Julian Jansen himself said, sometimes things like the Iberian blackout can form something of an inflection point. My name's Jonathan Gifford, and enjoy this episode of this special podcast series. Thank you for joining the Powering Through podcast. Julian Jansen is the Managing Director, Growing Markets for Fluence, and Michael Schreiber is the Head of Flexibility with Octopus Energy. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining the Smarter E podcast today.
Real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Well, I think there's no better time to talk about grid stability, energy security, flexibility, given recent events. It's too soon to know, really, the precise causes behind the Iberian blackout that left 50 to 60 million people without power, but it's definitely brought energy security here in Europe front of mind. Julian, naturally from Fluence, you're very passionate about the role of large-scale energy storage in Europe and in many markets around the world. Could more batteries have prevented the blackout in Spain and Portugal?
I think first and foremost, what it really brought home was how dependent we are on electricity in everything we do. And I think people forget that very easily. But that country literally stood still, right? Nothing worked. And that really, I think, brings into light the criticality of energy security as a whole. So when it comes to your question regarding the role of large-scale energy storage, it's too soon, as you said, to speculate around the causes. But I think what's a clear fact is that energy storage as part of a wider mix of energy technologies in the system can play a critical role in providing grid stability and increasing security of the grid. And if we think about the Spanish context, today there's only around 200 megawatt of battery energy storage installed in Spain. So a very, very, very small number. There's a larger fleet of pumped hydro energy storage, but pumped hydro has a different role to play, particularly around temporal shifting of electricity. So when we think about battery energy storage, even though there's a 12 gigawatt target number by the government for 2030, we're a long way from achieving that. When we think about battery energy storage, and that comes to your question around the blackout, it's not just about the temporal aspect of time shifting electricity, but critically, storage has two other roles to play. One is resource adequacy, so basically providing backup to the grid. The other one is grid stability. And this is often overlooked because for advanced applications and advanced controls, energy storage can provide grid forming capability, synthetic inertia, so mimicking the rotating masses that we are taking offline as we are decommissioning fossil-based generation, but also provide black start capability and voltage control, so also able to bring the grid back much quicker. So while I wouldn't say the blackout wouldn't have happened because of with energy storage, it's also clear the more energy storage we have in the system, the more resiliency we have and the more ability we have to limit blackouts and to bring the grid back up in a more quicker and effective way.
Well, 200 megawatts is not very much battery energy storage that Spain has installed in 2025. I was at a conference, I think spring last year in Madrid, and there was a lot of solar developers there, and they were all tearing their hair out about price cannibalization, saying, the sky was falling. How on earth are we going to build solar projects? And that was the first time I looked into energy storage in Spain. And I was shocked to realize such a sunny place with so much renewable energy capacity and so much renewable energy potential that storage was lagging so far behind. Do you know why that is, Julian?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple reasons for it. I think Spain should have the strongest fundamentals for energy storage because not only has it got the renewable penetration you mentioned, but also it has limited interconnectivity, right? So therefore, it's functioning almost like an electrical island, which increases the fundamental need for storage and the value that storage can provide significantly. But if we think about the market as a whole, it's been marred by really general uncertainty on the regulatory framework. First, for a long time around market access, around ancillary services. Now it's around a lack of certainty around the capacity mechanism. But also when we think about the upcoming subsidy mechanism, there's a lot of finer details still not clear, which means there's no security for potential investors. And then if we look at the projects that already received funding under the PERTE program, actually it's being marred by permitting issues now, and projects are not moving forward. So we estimate that maybe around 25% of the projects that received the initial PERTE funding have actually transacted, because most of them are being delayed through the permitting process. So even though you have very strong fundamentals, you're actually throwing subsidies at those systems as well from the European Recovery and Resiliency Fund and the Modernization Fund. You do not have the same acceleration of deployment, one, because of market and regulatory topics, and the other through the permitting side. And I think if you compare that to some other markets where, for example, in Italy, authorization, grid permitting has to be in place before an auction clears. In Spain, you have the issue projects could apply for it where not all of that was guaranteed. And that's slowing down ultimately the development of the market and really putting at risk that 12 gigawatt target the government has put out for 2030.
Well, sorry, Michael, please jump in.
As far as I heard, so the only really market that was accessible for a long time was the wholesale market. And you needed like a minimum of 100 megawatt to go into the ancillary services. And this is nothing you usually start a project with, right? You could add it to the whole pool, but no experience and so on. And so there was not the framework to build storage. But just building storage is not enough. I think we also need to change frameworks because like frequency containment reserve most likely would not have solved what we have seen. And we need incentives like for, as you said, synthetic inertia. And yeah, we don't know what has happened. But during that time, we had 70% renewable generation. And we have this little storage. So, most likely this has a strong influence, and we will find out.
Well, we know that frequency definitely played a role, and there's been already a number of...
There was these swings,
Yeah, exactly. These oscillations, right? And they seem to have spiraled out of control and as generators disconnected. What role could have storage played? Could have it played a counteracting force in terms of drawing down power when the frequency was rising and then vice versa when the frequency was falling? Because we do know one thing about batteries, and this is why they're so successful in ancillary services provision. And every time there's an opportunity to bid for these services, we know that storage is really good at doing this. It's a digital thing, right? It switches on and off and can charge and discharge relatively quickly. Do you think that could possibly have been effective, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, without exactly knowing what actually has happened, it's hard to tell. I mean, then as far as I know, like 2 generating units went then offline, but this was after the oscillation, and then so much power was lost, and this would not have been covered with frequency containment reserve because this is how you not design a system. But maybe the oscillations itself could have been avoided by doing so. And definitely, open up the market, frequency containment market for battery storage is something that we did in other countries. And like lowering the barriers of how much available capacity you need to have. This is definitely something we need to follow and have an harmonization in those countries.
Yeah,
I think you can't speculate about the Spanish case, as Michael rightly said, but I think you draw on comparisons in other markets, right? Look at, for example, the penetration of storage in Ireland with specific requirements to respond in less than 150 milliseconds. And actually there you see when it's a frequency event, right? Again, we don't know if it's actually a frequency event that caused the challenge in the Spanish market. But there, it's very clear storage is responding so quickly in an island grid that's hugely penetrated by wind, right? Again, a different type of resource. And there it's very complementary and can arrest some of those frequency deviations very effectively. So the more we look at those type of examples, and especially start looking at the kind of, call it island grids, and then you expand from there onwards, you really see the effectiveness of battery storage in action.
And also in countries where it happens in the past, for example, in Australia and UK, where we had nationwide outages. Afterwards, we had these bigger storage sites also providing inertia or synthetic inertia. And afterwards, it didn't happen there anymore. So I think we need to have a close look and to learn and to shape the system in a way that this is avoided in the future.
Yeah, well, I'm originally from Australia. I've lived in Germany for many years. And actually was in Australia around the time, I think it was a week after the blackout in South Australia in 2016. And right, we saw then that was the world's first 100 megawatt battery provided by Tesla under some kind of bargain between, or as a Twitter kind of deal done between the state premier and Elon Musk in kind of typical fashion. But the system was delivered within 100 days. It was the world's first 100 megawatt system. And I think crucially, part of that capacity of the system was set aside for frequency response, right? And that's what the government paid for. They were like, right, we're going to put the money down for that and just have that in reserve, because South Australia, like Spain, at 10 times smaller, mind you, was very thinly connected. And when the interconnectedness went down, it became islanded and things spiraled out of control.
But I think it's so critical that, people talk a lot about frequency regulation when they talk about storage, but you need to go the steps further around the advanced capabilities, like synthetic inertia, like grid forming capability, like black start, right? And that's something we've seen, for example, again, in the GB context in Great Britain, where you had various different frequency products, different types of response times and remuneration mechanisms. But then they introduced a stability pathfinder specifically to solve grid stability issues. And again, that is something that storage can provide. So coming back, when the industry started out, everyone used to bring the Swiss knife analogy with them, right? Every presentation had this wonderful Swiss army knife on it, and storage is the Swiss army knife of the energy transition. But in that context, it's true. People focus so much on singular applications with storage, but actually it goes so much deeper. And it's a critical grid infrastructure asset. It's not a generation asset. It's not a backup asset. It's not a flexibility asset. It can do all of those things. In the end, it's critical grid infrastructure. And if we drive advanced controls, capability, and requirements into those systems, it means we are mimicking the inertia we're losing from the decommissioning of rotating mass. And it's bringing with it a huge number of other benefits at a local and overall transmission level.
I have to agree with you that I don't really like the Swiss Army knife analogy, because when have you ever used a Swiss Army knife for anything, right? It's got all the different tools, but maybe the toothpick, I don't know. But let's talk not just about storage. Michael, you drive flexibility at Octopus, which is a highly innovative energy retailer. Let's set out, what do we mean by flexibility beyond storage? Naturally, we mean on the demand side. Can you set out kind of some of those use cases or definitions of flexibility on the network?
Yeah, so I'm head of Flex for the German market. So this is where I'm most experienced. And what it means basically is that we build up a big portfolio of end customers that have flexibilities, meaning EV, storage, and heat pumps. So that we have assets where we can shift energy, where we can feed back or shift the consumption. What we then do is we have our technology platform, which is Kraken and Kraken Flex. We need to have to connect those assets and to control them in a smart manner. So this is also something we are heavily working on to get more access to assets that are important for the German market. And then, we want to open up markets for these flexibilities, because more or less what we can do in the German market is that we optimize them on wholesale market, meaning spot market, in the auction, in the intraday continuous market, but they are not really open for other services yet. And this is something we definitely do. We see tendencies, again, in the German market that we have this very expensive and slow smart meter rollout because DSOs, they want to control on their own. We think this is not necessary. It's too expensive and it doesn't really work. But we have the capability to control already, and we just need the incentives. We need the incentives from the DSO, TSO, TSO in order to deliver the products that they need and to help them. And this is something we could do, and we need to create the market for.
And primarily when you're talking about these controllable loads, whether they, distributed
load and storage, yeah.
Yeah, so load and storage. But in terms of loads, it's primarily EV charging and heat pumps. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. I mean, we also have these wholesale tariffs where you pay the spot price and then people can optimize, and they can optimize their white goods or anything else manually. But I mean, this is nice, but it doesn't really have a huge effect, right? If you have like an 11 kilowatt charging EV, storage has the same power, heat pump maybe a bit below, but this is where you have the automation and where you have the lots amount of power and capacity. So this is what we mainly do, yeah.
And it's primarily about not charging at the wrong time. Is that right? So you don't want to be, or not charging rather, not drawing down load at the wrong time. You don't want to be heating your house flat out at peak period of electricity demand or charging your EV. Is that right?
I mean, this is true for unidirectional cars, and it's also true for heating. There you want to cut out the most expensive quarter hours, and this can be from a market, but also from a grid perspective. But the technology is also ready for storage, which is then per se bidirectional. In Germany, mainly it's used for behind-the-meter PV optimization, but this is hopefully also a market that will open up, and then we are also ready to do it in a bidirectional way. And also cars is something we lose a lot out of opportunity if we just keep it unidirectional and only shift charging, as you said. But yeah, mainly it is currently the case for these assets yet.
Just at this moment until the kind of regulations catch up.
Yeah. I mean, for storage, for example, there's high incentive that you consume as much as possible of your own generated PV energy, and people really like this here and they make a sports out of it. So we don't actually touch the storage in summer, but there we just do this or let this PV optimization run. But these are stranded assets in winter. In winter, they are not used, and we have now launched a new product where we offer optimization in winter. So we basically charge the storage from the grid, and then when energy is expensive, we cover our own household load using storage, and then you get a bonus on every kilowatt hour that we charge through your battery, and so it's a business case for us and for the customers.
Yeah.
But you know what I love about this, Michael? Just listening to you explain it for a long time, right? For 15 years, people have said, "Oh, you need to get the consumer to not look at to be seen as just the metering point." That's what retailers used to do. I think what you're doing there is really making it like tangible for the consumer, and they can buy into that, and that at the same time enables you to control those loads and actually benefit the system and ultimately benefit your bottom line as well. But I think that's really impressive how you've changed that narrative with the consumer alongside it and get buy-in into technologies that usually most, call it the normal person, just doesn't have access to and has no imagination around.
Yeah, you need to make the consumer offering very simple, definitely. And consumers, I mean, in other countries it might be different if you're more used to it, but here you are not. And so you are very skeptical if you now be exploited to the risk of the spot market price and costs. And so our customers, some of them, they try it, but then after a year they say, "Oh, I want to go back to the other product, to your flagship product where I get bonuses, but where I have like no risk and everything, because I found out it's more expensive. I don't want to change my life. My family does not." So this is actually something that we see, and this is super important. On one side, and the other side is that we have decoupled the price that customer pays and what we do at the market. So we are not limited because customers pay spot market price. We need to optimize for spot markets, but this is not how the product works that we have designed. So it's decoupled, and we can do whatever we want, and we don't actually need to explain to the customer for what service it's currently used. This was knife. They don't care. They just get their bonus, and we can do whatever we want, and use the markets that are most valuable at the point in time.
Yeah, I want to touch back on that kind of consumer-facing part. I think it's a fascinating dynamic, people letting third parties, utilize what you say rightly as a stranded asset in the winter months, batteries at home. But I also wanted to touch on kind of the bigger picture, because utility scale batteries, as we discussed, have a lot of utility to the grid. We hear a lot about flexibility, and we have for a long time. And I think Octopus is a really great example of actually putting flexibility to work and making some progress with commercial customers who can be very influential and powerful, but also lots of residential customers. But Julian, do you ever see it a bit as a zero-sum game, kind of these flexibility efforts and large-scale battery storage? Or do you think that battery storage market, there's so much in front of it at the moment that there's always going to be a room for large-scale?
I think one of the fundamental pieces, and sometimes this is a little bit the challenge of our industry, I may even say, right? I've been in storage now for over 10 years, spent a lot of time on residential, now for the last few years really on the large utility scale. And often there's people trying to create these competitions, right? Residential or behind the meter versus front of the meter, long duration versus shorter duration, different technology types. But I find it really strange because actually as a whole, and as an industry as a whole, we are fighting a battle for acceptance today, right? People are struggling to understand the energy transition, even though it will drive down their cost, it will make the energy supply more secure, it will make it more sustainable in the long term, but still there's an acceptance problem. So what we need to do as an industry is actually think about what is the one simple message. And actually here, it's all about complementarity and interplay, right? You have to solve both the demand and the supply side. And only then can we be successful. And the need for flexibility is so significant that we need all of those technologies to interplay off each other. And at the same time, right, there's services, as we talked about earlier with regards to Spain. The residential battery is not going to provide grid stability, right? That you need large utility scale transmission connected storage for that. But then at the same time, smaller behind the meter assets can, for example, solve a lot of problems on the distribution level, right? So in the end, there is a lot of interplay, and I don't think it's an either or debate. There's different use cases, but together, can it solve that flexibility challenge? And if we look at it disparately, then it will not.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned acceptance, right? Public acceptance. And I think that's what Octopus has been really effective in doing, because, we've had VPP, virtual power plant concepts around for over a decade, and their uptake has been really not great. And that we've seen in parts of the world that there is a reluctance for third parties to access your air conditioner, your heat pump, your battery, right? This is my battery at my home. And I often felt that was a limit to the success or the utility of flexibility solutions that we'd been told about that could be so effective if only we could get more consumers to use them. So do you think, Michael, what's changed over the last 10 years? Why do you think people are more willing to engage in flexible pricing, the different flexibility models that you were outlining?
So I think it just became more prominent, and you hear about this in the media all the time. You get more used to it, and then you have this then just more present. And now, since like more EVs and more stationary storage is coming, and mainly not because of markets, but I mean storage is bought because of mobility. You want to drive, and then you have a secondary and a third use case, and this is then maybe your local PV consumption and then markets. And this is now something that is coming. So EV is not bought for grid, but it is bought for something else, and now it can be used for grid. And I think this is one perspective. The other perspective is that we saw not only in UK but also in Germany that there's lots of skepticism against your retailer, because retailers, they get you with a very cheap price, and if you then don't do anything, then they increase price after a year and everything, and this is the game that they play. This is something we don't do, and we have this very high good of customer happiness. We call it customer love. We do everything that customers are happy, and whenever a customer joins us, we try everything to avoid that he's ever leaving again. And I think like this fairness and transparency, and customer sees this, then they are also more willing like to share assets when they get reward for this. And we worked a lot on building this trust, and we can now use this to then utilize the assets and share values with customers.
I think to me it's a little bit right. You have good customer service and then a gamification. And for a lot of people that makes it good to engage and fun to engage. But what worries me a little bit talking about acceptance, it's not just about control of assets maybe in the home. And that's often people, right, they already have installed solar or they want to install a heat pump. We're seeing this real backlash against large scale renewables and storage sites. And right, if you think about the grand scheme, think about a storage site. Okay, you have maybe 2 football pitches full of quite low containers with very limited noise emission, and they're just like a building or whatever you want it to look like. And there's a lot of resistance from people, and like, deep resistance. And we've seen it just in Great Britain, local council elections, a lot of deep resistance against renewables in particular. And it really reminds me that kind of coming maybe what we can learn from that kind of Octopus model in a different context. How do you engage with those local resistance? And it's one, gamify it a little bit. Give a benefit to those local communities, right? It can be a very small reduction in their electricity bills or something else that they benefit from the fact there's large-scale solar, or there's a large wind farm offshore, or there's a storage asset nearby. And then also just help educate them and get them close by. Because what's the alternative? I mean, people have put up resistance, but would you rather have a coal-fired power plant in your backyard? Would you rather be looking at a nuclear plant? I mean, I don't want to. And I think when you give that choice to the majority of people, they would agree. But nonetheless, we're facing this backlash for large-scale assets because everyone says, I don't want it near me, but I don't know it, so I'm scared. And I think, can we learn from the consumer model or the retail model? How can we help drive acceptance for large-scale sites? To me, that's the only way we can be successful in the long term, because we have a lot more storage and solar and wind to build.
And so we have a very successful product here, which is Fan Club. With Fan Club, if you live close to a wind farm, you get a discount when the wind farm is spinning a lot. So when there's 50% of wind speed, then you get a 50% discount. And people like this really a lot. So it's not that there's something built and you got a one-time payment and that's it, and there's no connection to your wind farm, but you actually profit when there's wind and when it's spinning. And we actually saw that the neighbor communities, they approached us and they also wanted to have a wind farm and participate in something like this. So you actually need to make it tangible when you look outside and you see it. So you don't need to have like real optimization. You don't need to have dashboards, but you can only look outside of your window and you see it spinning, and then you do something. And this is really what activates people, and then make them happy also to install these things in their regions. And this is how we can activate them.
Yeah, an interesting model for engagement. There is one thing that does come up amongst the community, the general public, and we did see it with the Iberian blackout. I naturally was following things as we had news breaking and trying to get news from as many sources as possible. And one of the first things I saw people speculating about was, this is a cyber attack. There's been a huge cyber attack on the Iberian Peninsula with renewable energy. When it comes to energy security and also distributed assets as well, cybersecurity is going to become more important. We need to make sure that malicious third parties can't access our home batteries or large-scale batteries on the grid. How justified are those kind of public fears, though, do you think, Julian?
I think they're hugely justified, actually. Think about it. If you want to cause maximum disruption to our way of life, attack the electricity system, right? It's as simple as that. Everything else stops. Well, phone stops, petrol pumps stop, everything stops, right? So to me, it's the ultimate disruption that you can cause. And if you think a bit wider, right, even in a physical war, attacking the electricity infrastructure, whether it's in a cyber way or physical way, like Russia is literally doing, right, day in, day out, attacking civilian energy infrastructure, that is how you cause maximum disruption for the population, but also for the ability to defend yourself. So I do not think it's overstated at all. I think what we need to be aware of is that we are living in a changing world, right? We are living in a changing world with different geopolitical poles, and some of the way we have been operating in the past is changing. And I think for me, as I said earlier, battery energy storage is critical grid infrastructure. Now, if we look at the pure facts in Europe, right, in the last year, the number of the market share of AC solutions from Chinese origin, so full AC block on grid scale energy storage in Europe, has gone from around 3% to around 48%. So, 46%. So huge increase in how much AC solutions we're bringing in from China. Now, that's not per se a problem, but what European policymakers need to decide is whether we want to make sure that our critical grid infrastructure meets the requirements and is controlled within Europe, or is a potential entry point for future conflict. And that's something that policymakers have to really think about. At Fluence, this is one of the core topics we think about day in, day out, is the way, how do we control our software? How do we build our control system to be safe and secure, to be compliant with current regulation, but importantly, meeting the requirements for energy security in the long term in Europe, because we do not want to create risks on our electricity system. And that's different to renewable side, right? To be very frank, it's different to a solar farm. Okay, what's the worst case? Solar farm goes offline. Worst case with an energy storage asset. Imagine if you have a 1 gigawatt storage asset and you make that drop instantly, or you suddenly make it charge, discharge in crazy patterns. That's going to disrupt not just the local area, but actually at a transmission level. And that's something that we need to avoid. So I think, to me, coming back to that point, European policymakers need to seriously think about what do they want. And ultimately, what we need is common rules on cybersecurity for all technologies. In state aid frameworks, we need to make sure that non-price criteria regarding cybersecurity is strongly considered. And then also, we need to address cybersecurity in the energy sector as a more holistic topic. It was done in mobile networks. And I think at an EU level and at a member state level, it's really important that we start looking at that. I'm not saying what conclusion we may or may not get to, but right now we're literally ignorant on the topic. And again, that's why for us, it's such a key topic. We invest very heavily in it, because that's the brain of a storage system. That's where the value sits.
And Michael, in the distributed sense?
Yep. So I fully agree to what you said. When something like this happens, we need to make sure that not like by media, then storage and renewables in general are blamed, that we really have a close look on what actually happened. What you have described is definitely something that we do not only see in the new world, but is also a risk in the old world, right? We have big power plants, more than 1 gigawatt, the number you have mentioned, and this is something that can also happen there. And both like from cybersecurity perspective, but also from resilience perspective, we will never have 100% security. This will be a system that will be super expensive, or you can only get close to 100. So what we only also need to take care of is like backup power, black start capability and all these things. But because it can happen, and we need to be quick in then restoring it and getting everything running again. So I think it's a combination. And yeah, it's not something that is completely new and only comes with storage, but something we already had before, and we haven't really had a close look as we should have.
No, I agree, and I think it's not. I don't think it's a problem at all with storage or renewables in the sense that it's a new issue, but we're building out those technologies so rapidly with minimal standards, minimal requirements in many markets. Some markets are now moving quite quickly, but some markets really are just inviting everything in on a pure capex basis, cheapest product wins, no requirements related to such criteria. So I think the difference is, I completely agree that the problem was there all along, but we are fundamentally changing it at a pace that the energy industry has never experienced before. And policymakers are not ready for that pace, and they need to now look at it and understand and decide how they want to treat it. That's kind of the way I look at it.
And it's the same at the retail business and the new assets that we get there. On the pro side, we have many different aggregators, we have many suppliers, and we have many OEMs providing or using different data center to control the hardware and so on. And so we have some heterogeneous market situation and assets, and that's definitely on the pro side. But the same what you said applies for these assets, because they're very vulnerable for such an attack. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, it's also one of the exciting things about the energy transition is solar has got so cheap, wind is extremely competitive, battery prices are falling fast, battery density is increasing. It is a fast-moving industry, and I think that's also encouraging because it needs to be to meet the challenge of climate change. Now, gentlemen, just as we round out this Smartery podcast today, can I get just a final thought from you? Just a quick comment. Julian, I'll start with you. The theme of the podcast series is resilience. What is your kind of vision for energy resilience in Europe? I suppose out to 2030 or so. How can we avoid more Portugal, Spain blackouts?
Well, I really want to not link it to that, because again, we don't know what happened, so we don't know how to avoid it right now. So,
fair enough.
But I do think about it from a resiliency perspective. I think in the end, it comes down, to 3 layers. Right? One layer is around providing critical flexibility to our system. And that can, for example, also then lead to reducing our import dependency on fossil fuels, right? Like one example was, I think Ember estimated that by storing wind and solar in battery energy storage, we would reduce 9 billion euros worth of gas cost, right? I think there was another figure where without the energy transitions, our fuel import bill would be 45 billion euros higher in 2025. So there's a lot of benefits that are coming from it by not being dependent on fossil fuel imports to provide flexibility. The other element, I think, as we've talked a lot about, is the grid stability topic, right? The advanced capabilities storage can provide. And we need to rapidly move to a place where we have more mandates for advanced technology, higher performance requirements, non-price criteria, especially where we have all of these state aid funded schemes, which is mandating more grid forming inverter capability and the controls capability to deliver those system stability services. And then finally, if we talk about that controls capability, making sure that what we're deploying is safe in the long term and make sure we meet those energy security requirements that we want to have in Europe and drive the value within Europe. Because actually, this acceleration in a changing geopolitical world should be a strength for Europe.
A positive message. Michael, what about for flexibility then going forward? What's on the horizon for increased system flexibility from your perspective as a retailer?
So prices came down a lot for these generators, mainly PV, and we see the same on the storage side. But storage is not only because price goes down, but because we want to move to electric mobility and electric heating, and price is only one of the components, but a major driver. And this will now accelerate. And so we have a changing generation portfolio, we have a changing consumption and storage portfolio, but we can't keep the grid and all the rules as they are, but we need to change this. We need to create market, we need to create services that are in line with the new assets that we will see, that they can use their strength, and this is the only way how we can make it resilient, cheap, and super green. And this is where we need to work on. So this was touched in the discussion before. If we only have incentives to optimize for wholesale markets, we won't do anything for the grid, because we need to run a business and we need to make most out of the flexibility and generate most of the highest profits. And what we are asking for is because grid costs are not the same all the time, and we need to be exploited to this grid cost in order to optimize for them, and then we can help DSOs and TSOs and the market to have such a system with high renewable penetration and secure and super cheap.
The rules are going to remain a very important regulatory for reform to meet growing renewables and these growing challenges. Michael Schreiber, the head of flexibility in Germany for Octopus Energy, and Julian Jansen, managing director, growing markets for Fluence. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this Smarter E podcast, powering through here at the Smarter E 2025 in Munich. My name is Jonathan Gifford. I'm the head of content for Climate Copy, and thanks for watching.